It had been a long week of back-to-back meetings and conference calls, and I was ready to return home. I'd been on a business trip in Chicago, my suitcase barely unpacked before I was flying off again. I'm the kind of person who works hard to maintain some semblance of a professional life. So when I'm on the road, it feels like everything else falls to the back burner, especially my personal life. I've always been close to my dad, even after my parents divorced. He and I had our moments, sure. There were times I wished he was more vocal about his support when my stepmom, Clara, would make passive-aggressive remarks. But he's my dad, and I loved him. I knew that, deep down, he always tried his best. But with Clara, that was another story. She came into the picture about 6 years ago, when I was 22. I had just graduated college and was navigating the overwhelming, confusing world of adult responsibilities. I thought my dad had finally found someone who made him happy, someone who could share his life with him after my mom. But Clara wasn't who I expected. She was different. A little too eager to jump into every conversation, a little too enthusiastic about controlling things in the house. I didn't mind that she decorated the guest room when I came home. I didn't mind that she wanted to rearrange the kitchen or add her touch to the place. But the longer she stayed, the more I noticed subtle changes. First, it was little things, moving my old photos off the walls, replacing family heirlooms with her own tchotchkes. Then came the bigger things. My dad would casually mention how they were planning on doing some upgrades to the apartment, or how Clara thought the place could use a more modern touch. It wasn't just the apartment. I started to feel like she was trying to push me out of my dad's life, like I was the unwanted visitor in the home we'd shared for years before she moved in. And I couldn't quite figure out why, especially since I wasn't a child anymore, just a woman trying to find her way in the world. But there it was, the unspoken tension. Every conversation felt like it had an edge, and whenever I came over, Clara was somehow always working on something in the apartment, or there was another thing she needed to take care of. It wasn't direct hostility, more like passive-aggressive manipulation. It was as if she was trying to stake her claim in everything, including the apartment that I'd inherited from my grandfather. When my grandfather passed away 3 years ago, I'd inherited his apartment in the city. It wasn't a mansion, but it was everything to me. A small, charming space that felt like home, full of old books and furniture I loved. My dad thought it would be a good idea for me to have a place of my own, so I could settle down. But I never really felt like it was just mine. Not when Clara was constantly reminding me how much better things could be if I just let her take over the apartment, the constant stream of suggestions. Oh, why don't you move your things into storage? Or, you don't need all of this space, do you? Made it feel like my presence was always an afterthought. To be fair, I hadn't been home much over the past year. Work had been demanding, and whenever I did return for brief periods, it was to pick up a few things or drop off laundry. The truth was, I didn't feel as welcome as I once had, so I started spending more time in the city, away from the apartment. And every time I came back, I noticed more things changing. The rug I loved was replaced with something Clara thought was more modern. The paintings on the walls were changed for new, sleek versions that made the place feel less homey. Despite all this, I never brought it up to my dad. I didn't want to cause trouble. He was happy with Clara, and she was always so convincing when she said it was all in my best interest. Still, deep down, I felt like I was losing something important. And that's where I was now, sitting on a plane, staring out the window as the city lights blinked below me. I was looking forward to getting home, unpacking my suitcase, and just being in my space again. My apartment was my sanctuary, my small rebellion against everything that felt too big. The thought of having Clara's influence infiltrate that made my stomach churn. As the plane touched down, I was eager to get back to my routine, but there was a nagging feeling that something was off. I'd called my dad earlier in the day just to check in. He had mentioned Clara had been spending more time at the apartment lately, But I didn't think much of it. She'd always been around, and I figured it was just another attempt at bonding. It wasn't until I opened the door to the apartment, dragging my suitcase behind me, that I realized just how wrong I was. The lights were on and the sound of laughter floated from the living room. I stood in the hallway, frozen, as I heard Clara's voice echoing through the door. My heart sank when I stepped inside and saw her sitting on the couch, feet up, watching TV like she owned the place. My place. "Oh, hey there," she said, grinning wide. "Looks like I'm here for good, huh? This place is mine now." My stomach twisted in disbelief. This wasn't happening. I stood there, at the threshold of the apartment, with my suitcase still in hand, not entirely sure what to make of the scene in front of me. Clara was sprawled on the couch, acting like she'd been living there for years. The place, my place, was a mess of clothes and books strewn across the coffee table, the remnants of some half-finished project that, knowing Clara, was probably hers. I had expected to walk into a quiet apartment, my own little corner of the world, where I could finally unwind after a stressful week of back-to-back meetings. Instead, I found her sitting there, as if this was her territory. She didn't even seem to notice my entrance at first. "Clara?" I finally asked, my voice shaky as the reality of the situation began to settle in. She looked up, her smile far too wide, almost smug. "Oh, hey! Welcome home! It's been so nice, having this place all to myself for a little while. Your dad and I were just talking about how much better it feels with the space to ourselves. Honestly, it was getting cramped with all of your stuff here." She motioned vaguely toward the piles of my things that were shoved into corners. "It's like this apartment was made for me." I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or scream. "What do you mean, made for you?" I asked, taking a tentative step forward, trying to keep my voice steady. Clara stretched and patted the couch next to her, as if offering me a seat, though it felt more like a command. "Oh, honey, didn't you know? Your dad and I were talking, and we decided that it just makes sense for me to be here permanently. After all, it's a little too big for just you, right?" Her tone was syrupy sweet, but there was an underlying smugness that I couldn't ignore. "I've been rearranging things, giving it the fresh start it needed. Your grandfather's things, while nice, weren't really, how do I put this? Modern enough. We've been updating the place, making it feel like home for both of us." I felt a rush of anger bubbling up, but I forced myself to stay calm. I had to be rational, had to handle this without making a scene. "You can't just claim my apartment like that, Clara," I said, keeping my voice even. "This is my home, not yours. You can't just come in here and take over. You don't have the right to do that." Her smile faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered, brushing off my comment with a laugh. "Sweetheart, your dad and I talked about this. He's fine with it, and honestly, you haven't even been around that much anyway. It just makes sense, doesn't it? We're both adults. And let's face it, you don't exactly live here. You're always gone." She said it like she was doing me a favor. "That's not the point," I replied, my voice shaking now. I tried to stay in control, but it was getting harder. "This apartment was left to me by my grandfather. It's in my name. This is my place. You can't just move in and claim it as yours." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't seem surprised. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You've been so busy with work that you probably forgot to check the lease. Or maybe you didn't notice when we were having all those talks about space and updates. But it's fine. You're welcome to visit anytime. But you'll need to make sure you're not leaving your things everywhere." I blinked, the weight of what she was implying hitting me all at once. "What do you mean? You're trying to evict me?" I couldn't keep the disbelief out of my voice, my hands clenched into fists, my blood starting to boil. Clara leaned back into the couch, crossing her arms in a way that made it clear she felt completely at ease. "Well, I wouldn't say it like that, but yes, I do think it's time for you to move on. You're an adult now, and this is about making a fresh start. You know how much your dad and I have been wanting to get more settled in here. We're just trying to make this place work for us." My mind was reeling, my heart racing. I was shaking with anger, but I couldn't let her see how much she was getting to me. You can't just decide that. My name is on the deed. This is my apartment, not yours. You're not going to kick me out. Her expression didn't falter, and she gave a little shrug, as if this were all some sort of game. Sweetie, you're just too attached to things, you know? Maybe it's time for you to learn to let go. You've got plenty of options. We can help you find a new place if you want. It'll be fine, I'm sure. I felt a surge of anger I could barely control. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This wasn't just about her trying to take over my space anymore. This was an attack on everything I stood for. She thought she could walk in here, push me out, and claim it as hers without any consequences, but I wasn't going to let that happen, not without a fight. I turned around, heading straight for the desk drawer, where I kept the official deed to the apartment. I knew I'd been avoiding this confrontation for far too long, but there was no more running. It was time to show Clara exactly where the line had been drawn. Clara followed me, her voice now laced with a hint of annoyance. "What are you doing? I told you, this is for the best." I pulled out the deed, holding it up to her with steady hands. "This apartment is mine, Clara. It's in my name, not your dad's, not yours. You don't have the right to tell me what to do in my own home." Her eyes widened, her confident demeanor slipping for the first time. What are you talking about?" The look of shock and disbelief on her face as she stared at the document was priceless. I could see the change in Clara's expression before she even spoke. Her eyes flickered between the deed in my hands and my face, as if trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. I wasn't sure whether she was in shock or if she was trying to think of some new way to manipulate the situation in her favor. But whatever it wasn't going to work this time. "Is this some kind of joke?" Clara finally managed, her voice thin and tight, but still dripping with that fake sweetness she always wore. She took a few steps toward me, as if trying to get a better look at the paper I was holding. "What is this, really? I don't understand. Your dad—" "My dad didn't sign anything," I interrupted, cutting her off before she could twist this into one of her games. "I inherited this apartment from my grandfather. It's mine. It's in my name." My fingers gripped the paper tighter as I held it up, not just to prove a point, but because, for the first time in a long time, I felt a surge of confidence. The apartment had always been my sanctuary, but now this was my line in the sand. Clara's lips curled into a tight smile, but there was something almost desperate behind it. "Sweetheart, I don't know what kind of paperwork you're holding, but this is our home now. Your father and I decided this is what's best." Her words were so condescending, and I could feel my blood boiling. She wasn't listening to me, not in the way that mattered. She was dismissing me entirely, like she always had, but this time I had something she couldn't talk her way out of. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. "You can't just move in here and claim it as your own, Clara. You don't get to make that decision. It doesn't matter what your talks with my dad were. This apartment is mine. End of story." She stepped closer now, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, and I had to fight the urge to step back. I had been pushed around enough. I had spent too many years letting her undermine me, letting her take over what was mine, and I wasn't going to let it happen again. "I'm sure your grandfather would have wanted you to be reasonable about this," Clara said, each word oozing with false concern. "And I'm sure you wouldn't want to make this more difficult than it needs to be, right? It's about family. Your dad and I have been working together to make things better for all of us, and you're just making this harder than it has to be." I fought the urge to roll my eyes at the way she twisted everything into some sad attempt at manipulation. She knew exactly what she was doing, but now, instead of being intimidated, I was furious. Her constant undermining, her passive-aggressive comments, it all came flooding back to me in one rush of emotion. This wasn't just about her trying to claim the apartment. It was about her trying to erase me from my own life. "I'm not going anywhere," I said firmly, finally finding my voice. "This is my place. I don't care what your talks with my dad have been. He's not the one who owns this apartment. I am." I could see her face harden, her jaw clenching as the words hit her. She opened her mouth again, her expression now one of disbelief and barely contained rage. You think your grandfather's will matters in this house? You really think you can just hold a piece of paper and that makes you the boss here? My chest tightened. It was like she was accusing me of everything I had never done. My grandfather's apartment wasn't just a piece of property. It was a symbol, something that connected me to him, to my family's history. I wasn't going to let Clara take that from me, not for any reason. Yes, it matters, I said, my voice steady, but the anger simmering underneath was undeniable. And you can't just waltz in here and take it. You can't take my family's history, Clara, just because you think you're entitled to it. She wasn't listening to me. I could see her mind racing, trying to figure out how she could turn this around. But there was nothing she could do, nothing she could say that would change the fact that I owned this apartment, that it was mine by every legal right. What do you want me to do then? Clara asked, her voice dropping to a cold, calculated tone. Do you want me to just pack up and leave? Because trust me, you're not going to get away with this. Her eyes flicked toward the hallway, as if trying to gauge the distance between us, but I didn't flinch. I wasn't backing down. Not this time. I want you to leave, I said simply, and I want you to stop trying to control everything. This is my home and I'm not going anywhere. You are. Clara's face twisted in something between anger and shock. She opened her mouth to say something, but I cut her off again, refusing to let her take control of this conversation. You don't get to call the shots anymore. You don't get to walk all over me like you have for years. If you don't want to leave, I'll have to get the authorities involved, because I'm done. She took a step back, her expression faltering for the first time. For the first time since she'd walked into my life, Clara didn't have an answer. But as I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I had just started fighting for what was mine, and Clara had no idea what was coming next. The next few days were a blur. I spent hours gathering documents, confirming every detail about the apartment's ownership, making sure I had everything in order. I knew Clara wouldn't just give up. If anything, she'd only escalate things. And my dad, I hadn't heard from him much. He had been quiet, distant, as if he couldn't decide where he stood in this mess. But I couldn't let that stop me. I refused to let Clara manipulate me or my father any longer. I had a plan, and this time I wasn't backing down. The confrontation with Clara had left me feeling raw. My emotions had been running high, but there was one thing I knew for sure. I was not going to lose this fight. Not now, not ever. And if Clara thought she could waltz into my life and claim everything for herself, she had another thing coming. I spent the next few days in a haze of preparation. The anger that had started to simmer in me after that first confrontation with Clara had only grown stronger. I wasn't just fighting for the apartment anymore. I was fighting for myself, for everything that she had tried to erase, my history, my space, and my place in my own family. I felt a burning need to take back what was rightfully mine. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Clara wasn't going to back down. She was going to make this as difficult as possible for me. She'd already manipulated my dad into thinking she was justified, probably filling his head with excuses for why she was just trying to make things better for all of us. But I knew better. This wasn't about making things better. This was about control, and I wasn't about to let her control my life, my apartment, or my family. I called the lawyer. I made sure every piece of paperwork was in place. I even called a locksmith, just in case things went south. I wasn't sure how Clara would react, but I knew she wouldn't give up easily. The worst part was that my dad, the one person I thought would stand up for me, had gone silent. Every time I tried to reach him, he was too busy or too evasive. And Clara, well, she was playing her role perfectly. She'd been nice to him, all sweet and innocent, pretending to be the loving wife, while she bulldozed everything I had left in my life. But I was done being the victim. This was my apartment, my inheritance, my future, and I wasn't about to let her take it from me. The day came when I knew I had to take the final step. Clara had been on her best behavior lately, at least, around my dad, but I could sense the tension in the air. The little digs, the condescending remarks, the constant suggestions about how the place should be run, all of it was building up to something big. I could feel it. That morning, I woke up early, feeling the weight of what I was about to do. I dressed carefully, methodically black pants, a blouse that made me feel powerful, and heels that clicked with each step I took. I grabbed the envelope with all the documents, every piece of evidence I had collected over the last few days. I didn't want to go through with it, but I knew I had no choice. Clara was not going to leave unless I forced her to. I could hear her voice from the living room as I approached the front door. She was talking to my dad, laughing in that annoying, high-pitched way she always did. I pushed the door open with a deep breath, my heart racing, but my resolve stronger than ever. As soon as Clara saw me, her smile faltered. "Oh, look who's here," she said, not bothering to hide the sarcasm in her voice. "I was just telling your dad how much better the place is looking now that it's—" "Stop!" My voice cut through her words like a knife. "I'm not here to listen to your excuses anymore, Clara. I'm here to put an end to this." She raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sudden change in my tone. My dad looked over at me, a blank expression on his face, but I could tell he was uncomfortable. He didn't know what was happening, but he could sense the shift in the air. "What are you talking about?" Clara asked, feigning innocence. "I'm just trying to make this place more livable. You're hardly ever here anyway." "I'm talking about you trying to take over my apartment." I was done with the pleasantries. "This place isn't yours. It's mine. And you can't just move in here and pretend it belongs to you." Her eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a tight, defensive smile. "This is ridiculous. We've been talking about this for weeks. Your dad and I—" "No," I interrupted, holding up the envelope with the deed in my hand. "This apartment was left to me by my grandfather. The deed says it's mine, and I've had enough of you pretending otherwise." I walked over to the coffee table, laying the documents down in front of her. Her eyes flickered nervously over the paperwork, but she didn't make a move to pick it up. Her facade of confidence was starting to crack, and I could see the tension in her posture. "Look, sweetheart," she said, voice shaking slightly. "Your dad and I—" "This isn't about your talks with my dad, Clara." My voice was firm now, stronger than I'd ever sounded before. "This is about what's legally mine, and you have no right to be here, no right to take what doesn't belong to you." Clara's eyes darted to my dad, as if searching for him to step in, to take her side like he always did. But he didn't. He just stood there, frozen, looking back and forth between the two of us. He didn't speak, he didn't move, and that, more than anything, told me what I needed to know. He knew I was right. Clara's expression faltered for a second before she regained her composure. "You think this little piece of paper is going to change anything? It's just a piece of paper, nothing more?" I shook my head. "It's not just a piece of paper. It's the truth. This apartment is mine, Clara. And you're not welcome here anymore." The room went silent. My dad, still rooted to the spot, hadn't said a word. But Clara? She was stunned, visibly shaken. I could see her weighing her options, trying to figure out how to worm her way out of this. But there was nothing she could say. No excuse that would work. It was over. "Fine," she spat, her voice sharp. "You want to make a scene? Fine. But just remember your dad and I were trying to do what's best for you. You'll regret this." She turned on her heel, storming toward the door, her fury radiating in the air. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. She was defeated. I could see it in the way she carried herself, the way she couldn't meet my eyes as she left the apartment for good. My dad, standing there, still hadn't said anything. He just stared at me, unsure of what to do. He looked like a man caught between two worlds, neither of which he fully understood anymore. But I wasn't waiting for him to figure it out. I'd waited long enough. "I'm sorry," I said softly, though I wasn't sure if it was for him or for myself. "But I'm not letting her take this from me." And with that, I turned and walked into the living room, finally feeling the weight of the space lift off my shoulders. I had won. It was over. I was finally free. The silence in the apartment was almost deafening after Clara stormed out, her footsteps echoing down the hallway like a final exclamation point on the end of an exhausting chapter in my life. My heart was still racing, but there was something else beneath the adrenaline, a deep, almost foreign sense of relief. I'd done it. I'd stood up for myself in a way I hadn't done before, and for the first time in a long time, I felt powerful. I turned around to face my dad. He was still standing there, not saying anything, his hands shoved into the pockets of his slacks. His face was a mixture of confusion and concern, like he was trying to process everything that had just happened. But his eyes didn't meet mine, not once. Are you okay?" he finally asked, his voice hesitant, almost uncertain. I took a deep breath, still trying to calm the storm that was swirling inside of me. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice was steadier than I'd expected. "I had to do this, Dad. I had to take back what's mine." He nodded slowly, but there was a hesitation in his eyes that stung. "I didn't think it would come to this." "I didn't realize how much you were hurting." I felt a pang in my chest at his words, but I quickly pushed it aside. I didn't have time for self-pity. I wasn't going to go down that road again. "Why didn't you say anything?" I asked, the question finally spilling out, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "Why didn't you tell me what was going on?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long, slow breath and exhaled. "It's complicated," he said, his voice quiet. "Clara, she's been very convincing. She's always had a way of making things seem like they're for the best. She told me you were hardly ever home, that you were too busy for this place. I didn't want to make things worse, didn't want to cause conflict." I bit my lip, trying to keep the tears that were threatening to well up at bay. My dad had always been passive when it came to Clara. He'd always chosen the path of least resistance. It was easier to let her take control than to rock the boat. But I wasn't going to let him hide behind that excuse anymore. Not now. Not after everything she'd tried to take from me. "She took advantage of you, Dad," I said, my voice low but firm. "She knew what she was doing, and you let her. This apartment, it's not just a building, it's my inheritance. It's my connection to Grandpa. You can't just let her take it because she wants a bigger house. It wasn't her decision to make." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. Maybe it was regret, or maybe it was guilt, maybe both, but it was there. "I'm sorry," he said, and the sincerity in his voice made me pause. "I never meant for you to feel like you weren't important to me, that your feelings didn't matter. I didn't want to cause more drama." I swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I get that, but I needed you, Dad. I needed you to see what was happening and stand by me, not just let her push me around." There was a long pause as he processed my words. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the situation had settled on him for the first time. "You're right," he said quietly. "I should have done more. I should have fought for you, but I'll do better. I promise." I let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension in my body begin to ease. For the first time, it felt like my dad was finally seeing me, not just as his daughter, but as an adult with her own life, her own space, her own worth. I could feel the beginning of something new between us, something stronger and more honest. But it wasn't going to be easy, and I knew that. This was just the first step. "I'm not asking you to pick sides, Dad," I said softly. "I just want you to respect me. Respect what's mine. That's all." He reached out then, his hand hesitating for a moment before resting gently on my shoulder. "I do respect you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know how to show it." I nodded, accepting his words, though it didn't erase the years of tension. It didn't make up for the times he had let Clara run the show, but it was a start. We stood there for a moment, just the two of us, in the apartment that had always felt like home to me. It felt different now. It felt like mine again. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to smile. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions. Clara didn't contact me again, which I was grateful for, though part of me wondered if she was plotting her next move. But I didn't care anymore. I'd taken back control, and that was all that mattered. My dad, despite his initial hesitation, became more involved in the aftermath. He helped me fix the small things around the apartment that Clara had ignored, minor repairs that she'd brushed off as unimportant. He listened when I talked about my plans for the future, my work, my goals. And for once, it felt like we were both really present in each other's lives. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy to rebuild the trust that had been shaken over the years. But we were getting there. Slowly, but surely, we were finding a new way forward, and it felt right. As I sat down in the living room later that evening, looking around the apartment that was finally mine, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. Clara was gone, my dad and I had started to rebuild what had been broken, and I had finally found my voice. It wasn't just about the apartment, it was about standing up for myself when no one else would. It was about learning that I could fight for what I deserved without being afraid of the consequences. I was stronger now, more confident in who I was, and more determined than ever to hold on to what was mine. It had been a long battle, but in the end, I won.